Autumn 1945. On the southern island of Kyushu, the night settled over the paddies like a low, damp curtain. The rice was heavy on the stalks, bending under its own weight, rows of gold disappearing into the dark. Crickets rasped in the dikes. Somewhere a dog barked once and fell silent. An old farmer stood at the edge of his field, bare feet in the cold mud, cotton jacket patched and repatched across the shoulders. For years he had tilled this same plot under the rising sun flag, listening to voices on the radio warn of American monsters who would burn, loot, and dishonor everything they touched. Now in the darkness, those same Americans were spaced along his field. Helmets glinted faintly, rifles were slung at the ready. They spoke in low English murmurs he could not understand, boots planted on the narrow earthen ridges he had shaped with his own hands. Their orders were simple: stay here all night so no one stole the harvest. The farmer's breath shook. The war had ended in ruin. In words from the emperor he still struggled to believe. Yet here, on this small strip of earth, a different kind of ending was unfolding. In the last full year of the war, the old man's field had already begun to shrink in his mind. By 1944, the war that Tokyo had promised would bring a new order in East Asia was instead bringing emptiness to Japanese tables. The land had not changed. The same mountains ringed his valley, the same river flooded its banks in heavy rain. But everything else seemed to be thinning out. Young men disappeared first, called to the colors. Then tools, carts, even draft animals became scarce, swallowed by factories and army depots. What remained was muscle, patience, and rice. Rice was not just food. It was the core of life, the measure of labor, the taste of prosperity. It was offerings at the family altar and the quiet reassurance that tomorrow would be faced with a full belly. But by 1944, the government's white-painted slogans said something different. Every grain for victory. Officials arrived with clipboards and quotas, demanding deliveries that left farmers staring at their own storage bins, trying to decide how much they could risk hiding. In Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Yokohama, city families clutched ration books like lifelines. Official rice rations fell far below what a laborer needed to survive. Substitutes, barley, millet, sweet potatoes filled the bowls that used to carry white rice. Mothers queued in long, silent lines. Children learned to be grateful for thin porridge. Newspapers spoke of temporary hardship. Hungry stomachs called it something else. Above it all drifted a second, ever-present pressure: the war in the air. By mid-1944, American B-29 bombers were probing the skies over the home islands. First came high-altitude daylight raids on factories and steelworks. Then in early 1945, the campaign turned into something else entirely. On the night of March 9-10, 1945, Tokyo burned. Low-flying bombers loosed napalm and incendiaries over crowded wooden neighborhoods. Tens of thousands died in a single night of fire, heat, and smoke. The air war spread to Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of smaller cities. In the hushed corners of rural Japan, blackened photographs and rumors told the story. The cities were not safe. Yet even as bombs fell and ships sank, the demands on the countryside grew. The army requisitioned more rice, more vegetables, more charcoal. Village assemblies repeated the same lines broadcast from Tokyo. The Americans were ruthless. Surrender meant slaughter and shame. Better to die than be taken alive. Posters and schoolbooks depicted Americans as barbarians who would desecrate shrines, murder children, and violate women. For an elderly farmer in Kyushu, this message arrived in fragments. A son's letter from the front, a teacher's stiff voice at a village meeting, a crackling radio in the town office relaying speeches about final resistance. Off the coast, the war drew closer. American submarines strangled Japanese shipping. Tankers and freighters went to the bottom, taking fuel and imported food with them. Fishermen stayed closer to shore. Markets in the towns showed more empty stalls. In April 1945, the last great land battle of the Pacific opened on Okinawa, only a short stretch of water away. Refugee stories and garbled reports drifted back. Civilians caught between Japanese troops and American firepower, suicides on the cliffs, caves blasted by flamethrowers. Some officers told villagers to be ready. If the Americans landed on Kyushu, everyone would mobilize. Old men, women, and even children would form volunteer fighting units with bamboo spears and old hunting rifles. Underneath the slogans was a quieter, more immediate fear. If the war truly came here, what would happen to the harvest? The 1945 planting season was haunted by that question. Fuel shortages meant fewer pumps to drain fields, fertilizer was scarce, labor was thin, yet seed went into the mud all the same. It had to. The empire might collapse, but people would still need to eat. Crop failure or the loss of even a portion of the harvest could turn shortage into famine. Then suddenly, the voice that had urged resistance stopped shouting. On August 15, 1945, village loudspeakers crackled to life. People were called from the fields and workshops to stand in the sun and listen to a sound no one had ever heard before, the emperor's own voice. Faint, formal, distorted by primitive recording, it spoke of enduring the unendurable, of accepting the terms of the Allies. The words surrender and defeat were not spoken, but their meaning soaked into the crowd as surely as rain into rice paddies. For the old farmer, the announcement was less a clear break than the lifting of a constant pounding noise. The years of exhortation, fear, and threat did not vanish. They hung in the air. Now a new uncertainty took their place. If the Americans came, what would they do? Would they behave as the propaganda had promised? Would they seize food, trample fields, take what they wanted from women and houses? Or would they impose some new, colder order in which Japanese needs counted for little? He had no answers. The only certainty was that his land remained. The rice he had coaxed from the earth still stood, green slowly turning to gold. It would have to feed his family, perhaps his married daughter's children, perhaps even neighbors' hungry mouths. In a shattered country with burned-out cities and broken rail lines, the burden on each field grew heavier by the day. In the weeks after the surrender, rumors shifted. Some said the Americans would seize everything to feed their troops. Others said they would distribute food from warehouse stocks. Still others whispered that Soviet forces might also land, and no one knew what that would mean. Across Japan, the question was the same: in defeat, who would control the food? It was into this landscape of fear, hunger, and fragile hope that American ships anchored off Japanese ports, and foreign soldiers began to disembark onto home island soil for the first time. They came under a gray, exhausted sky. The occupation of Japan had been planned for months before the emperor's voice ever reached the rice paddies. In Manila, General Douglas MacArthur and his staff drew up the outlines of something unprecedented, a military government imposed on the very heartland of an enemy that had fought to the last island. He would be supreme commander for the Allied powers, SCAP, overseeing demilitarization, political reform, and above all, stability. On August 28, 1945, advance parties of American troops landed at Atsugi Airfield near Tokyo. Days later, larger forces waded ashore or stepped down gangplanks at ports stretching from Yokohama to Yokosuka. Steel helmets, olive drab uniforms, jeeps and trucks rolled into a landscape where horse carts and bicycles still dominated the roads. In the southwest, toward Kyushu, American naval task forces anchored off Sasebo and Nagasaki. Elements of the U.S. Marine Corps, battle-hardened divisions that had fought on Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, were reassigned to a new mission, occupation duty. Their task was not to assault beaches under fire, but to accept surrenders, secure naval bases, and oversee disarmament in and around the cities and countryside of western Japan. Orders were blunt and repeated often. There would be no looting, no harassment of civilians, no drunken rampages. Any man caught stealing or abusing Japanese people would face courts-martial. The same Marines who had been trained to close with and destroy the enemy were now told to holster their hatred and treat that same enemy with a firm, distant respect. MacArthur's headquarters, established in Tokyo, was clear on one point: chaos was the real enemy now. Japan was exhausted. Rail lines lay twisted from bombing, bridges had dropped into rivers, ships lay broken in harbors. Industry was shattered, yet the gravest threat was not political, it was hunger. Even before surrender, Japan's food system had been close to collapse. The loss of Korea and Taiwan cut off major sources of rice. Submarines had strangled coastal shipping. Air raids had paralyzed freight yards and warehouses. With defeat, millions of soldiers and civilians began to stream back from former colonies and battlefronts, swelling the population that needed to be fed. In Tokyo, the official daily rice ration for most workers fell to barely enough to sustain life. In practice, many received less. People spoke of supplemental nutrition with bitter humor: weeds, acorns, anything that could fill a stomach. Children fainted in classrooms. Cases of edema and tuberculosis rose. Government ministers warned privately of the possibility of hundreds of thousands of deaths if the coming winters went badly. Under such pressure, food became more than a commodity, it was power. The black market flourished in burned-out city lots and along station platforms. Rice, hoarded in villages or siphoned from official channels, could fetch fantastic prices. For a farmer in Kyushu, a sack of unreported rice might be traded for cloth, tools, or medicine. For black market middlemen, it could mean a fortune. For a hungry family in a Tokyo slum, it meant the difference between a child surviving the winter or not. The Japanese state, which had long claimed to direct every grain, was suddenly weak. The pre-war and wartime police, distrusted and discredited, had lost much of their authority. Their uniforms still carried power in villages, but in the cities they were just another group trying to manage queues and quell fights around food depots. Many officers were themselves underfed, underpaid, and tempted by illicit trade. SCAP's foreign officers, studying reports in Tokyo, understood that if food distribution broke down entirely, desperation could turn into unrest. There was also a geopolitical shadow. Soviet forces had already seized the Kuril Islands and occupied parts of northern Korea. A starving Japan racked by riots and strikes might prove fertile ground for communist influence. So food security became a military priority. American planners pressed Washington for grain shipments. Liberty ships loaded with wheat and other staples began to cross the Pacific. But moving imported food from port to plate required functioning railways, guarded warehouses, and some minimal trust between ordinary Japanese and those now in command. At the same time, the existing Japanese system of compulsory rice deliveries remained in place, now under Allied supervision. Farmers were still required to turn over quotas to the state, yet many resisted, hiding a portion of their crop in sheds under floorboards or in remote paddies. They remembered wartime promises that the state will provide and compared them to empty shelves. In this climate, a new phenomenon grew: food raids. Groups of urban residents, sometimes organized by unions or neighborhood associations, sometimes just loose bands of the desperate, would travel by train or truck into rural districts. They came armed not with rifles but with numbers, with the hungry bodies of their families. Arriving in villages, they demanded to buy rice at prices far above the official level. When rebuffed, some turned to intimidation or force, rushing fields, raiding storehouses, seizing sacks before local police could respond. Newspapers, heavily censored by SCAP, covered such events cautiously, but the countryside knew the stories. For a small cluster of farm households, the arrival of hundreds of gaunt strangers on the road from the station was deeply unsettling. Village councils and prefectural authorities petitioned both Tokyo and the local American commands. More protection was needed if the harvest was to be preserved. For the Marines on occupation duty in Kyushu, the orders that filtered down reflected this new reality: patrol the docks, guard the ammunition dumps and the naval yards, assist in disarming Japanese units, and increasingly support local authorities in maintaining public order, especially around food. Language barriers made everything slower. Few Marines spoke any Japanese beyond a handful of phrases. Almost no villagers knew English. Army and Navy interpreters translated formal meetings. On the ground, gestures, repeated words, and the watchful presence of rifles conveyed meaning. In some prefectures, Japanese officials approached American officers with specific requests. Could a squad be posted near a vulnerable warehouse? Could patrols check the roads after dark to deter large raiding parties? Could a visible Allied presence, even silent and non-interfering, help restore a sense of order? The answers varied with local commanders, but one principle remained: preventing looting and protecting essential resources was in the interest of the occupation. An empty stomach could turn respectful obedience into something more volatile. In coastal cities like Nagasaki and Sasebo, where Marines lounged uneasily in requisitioned buildings and patrolled streets lined with makeshift stalls, the link between hunger and tension was evident. Just beyond those cities, in the valleys and terraces where rice bent in the wind, the stakes were even clearer. If the harvest was stripped by black marketers or desperate raiders, no amount of imported grain would fully compensate. This is how, in the first months after surrender, young men trained for amphibious assaults found themselves drawn into an entirely different front line. The invisible boundary between starving cities and anxious villages, between fields heavy with rice and hands reaching to take it. In that space, on cold nights along muddy dikes, the lives and assumptions of an old Japanese farmer and an American Marine would intersect. For the farmer, the land was older than any flag. He had been born in the late Meiji years, when the emperor was young and the idea of marching armies across Asia was still distant chatter. As a boy, he learned the seasons with his bare hands. Spring meant standing ankle-deep in cold water, pressing seedlings into mud until his back ached and his fingers went numb. Summer heat meant the buzzing of insects above green shoots. Autumn meant the slow satisfaction of watching heads of rice swell and bow. Winter meant mending tools, praying for the next year's luck. He had never seen Shanghai or Manila or the jungles where his sons disappeared. The wars that built and broke the empire reached him through tax collectors, through military policemen, through posters pasted on the walls of the village school. When the first of his sons left in uniform, he bowed toward the train and told himself that sacrifice had meaning. When the letters grew farther apart, he told himself that endurance would be rewarded. The stakes reached tighten with each campaign. Quotas were set high and rose higher. Officials measured harvests, inspected barns, and wrote down numbers that did not care about late frosts or flooded dikes. A man who held back rice risked fines, denunciation, even arrest. Yet a man who handed over everything could not feed his own. So he learned the quiet art of calculation: how much to declare, how much to hide, where to stack sacks so that the eyes of inspectors might slide past. Then the radio began to speak of invaders. Americans, it said, were inhuman. They would tear up fields, steal food, desecrate family graves. In the fields, the farmer tightened his jaw and straightened his back. Hatred did not come easily to him, fear did. Fear for the land, for the grain that kept his family alive. When bombs fell on nearby cities, the sky over his valley glowed faintly at night. He imagined columns of foreign soldiers walking through his paddies, boots crushing seedlings. That thought stayed with him longer than any speech from Tokyo. For the Marines who finally came ashore, the landscape of Kyushu was both foreign and grimly familiar. They were young, most of them, 19, 20, 22. They had climbed volcanic ridges on Iwo Jima under mortar fire, crossed coral reefs at Tarawa, slogged through the killing fields of Okinawa. They had seen caves turned into tombs. They had watched civilians leap off cliffs rather than come into their lines. The training depots back home had filled their speech with jokes about nips and Japs, stripped down the enemy into something easier to kill. Now the enemy's homeland lay before them, quiet and subdued. They stepped from trucks into streets lined not with pillboxes, but with wooden houses patched after air raids. They marched past shrines where old women bowed stiffly and refused to meet their eyes. Their boots crunched on gravel paths between fields unmarked by shellfire. The rifles they carried felt the same as on any other campaign, but the men on the other end were different. Farmers, shopkeepers, children tugging at the sleeves of mothers who whispered hurried warnings. Occupation orders drilled into them a new discipline. No more souvenir raids, no more smashing through doors except under strict authorization. Each man was briefed. There would be no mass reprisals, no indiscriminate shootings. Patrols would be observed by officers. Complaints from Japanese civilians would be taken seriously. Any Marine caught abusing civilians could expect punishment as harsh as if he had struck a fellow American. Yet the instincts of war did not vanish in a day. Some men walked with hands always close to their weapons, eyes scanning rooftops for snipers that were not there. Others, when not on duty, wrote uneasy letters home describing the bizarre shift, 1 month in a foxhole, the next directing traffic in a city the enemy had once sworn to defend to the last man. When they were told to guard a warehouse, they understood. Ammunition, fuel, supplies, these were things armies fought over. When they were assigned to patrol rail lines, it made sense. Trains carried power. Orders to help protect food supplies fit a similar logic. A hungry population could be dangerous. But the first time a squad was told to spend the night along the edge of a rice field, the strangeness sank in. They had fought their way across the Pacific to stand watch in the dark over an old man's crop. Hunger made the world bend toward that modest task. By the autumn and winter of 1945, hunger was not an abstraction in Japan. It was a physical presence in every line of people outside ration stations, every thin face turned toward a pot of watery soup. The official ration might promise a few hundred grams of rice or other staples per day. In reality, deliveries fell short or came late or were diluted with husks and fillers. In that tightening vice, long-standing understandings about food, the moral economy that linked villages and towns, began to warp. In ordinary times, a farmer might sell a portion of his surplus in town, might extend credit to a neighbor in bad years, might accept that some grain would be lost to rats, birds, or the occasional petty thief. There were shared rituals of obligation, gifts of rice at weddings, contributions to festivals, anonymous kindnesses to families hit by illness. Food moved not only along market routes but along paths of duty and compassion. Total war and defeat strained those paths. State requisition pushed farmers to the limit. Bombing and blockade severed traditional flows of goods. City dwellers accustomed to buying food with money and queuing with ration cards now found that cash meant little without a willing seller. They boarded overcrowded trains to the countryside, carrying what they had left, cloth, furniture, even family heirlooms, to barter for grain. Most encounters were tense but non-violent, bargaining in courtyards, haggling on station platforms, carts piled with sacks under the wary eyes of local police. But where desperation deepened, restraint frayed. A group of 2 or 3 hungry men might slip into a field at night, cutting rice heads into cloth bags. Larger bands, emboldened by numbers and the knowledge that village constables were few, might push into barns or surround a farmer's house, insisting on purchase at prices that were effectively confiscation. For a man like the old farmer, already balancing between state demands and his own survival, such raids were terrifying. Each missing sheaf of rice was a fraction of his winter meals. Each stolen sack might mean selling tools or clothes to replace it, if it could be replaced at all. The faces of the raiders blurred. Were they returning soldiers with no work, city workers whose children were wasting away, black market brokers looking to profit from chaos? Their motives varied, the threat they posed did not. In that climate, the appearance of American troops with orders to deter theft, however modestly phrased, took on a larger meaning. The same foreigners who had bombed the cities now stood, conspicuously armed, at the very margins where the struggle between hunger and property played out. It was at those margins, between the dikes and the roads, between barns and back alleys, that another set of perspectives would come into focus. For the Americans tasked with keeping order, the countryside became a map of quiet, vulnerable points. Occupation duty in manuals and briefings sounded orderly: establish zones, secure key infrastructure, supervise disarmament. On the ground, it became a web of small responsibilities. A platoon might be assigned a sector that included a bomb-scarred port, a stretch of railway, a half-ruined town, and a scattering of villages whose names the Marines could barely pronounce. They learned the skeleton of local authority: the prefectural office in the nearest city, the district police station, the village headman who spoke for a cluster of hamlets. Meetings were arranged with interpreters from the civil affairs sections, Japanese-speaking Nisei from the US, or hastily trained linguists. In cramped rooms smelling of ink and coal smoke, American officers listened while thin, gray-faced officials explained their problems. Rail yards and warehouses were obvious flashpoints. Marines posted sentries at storage depots where government rice waited to be shipped, standing by as Japanese clerks checked ledgers and laborers hefted sacks. In some cases, patrols were directed to ride the tops of freight cars or sit in open boxcars, rifles across their knees, as trains rattled toward the cities. Their presence alone discouraged groups who might have tried to halt a train and strip it. But not all food sat in warehouses; much of it still stood exposed in the fields. As harvest approached, district police chiefs brought new requests. There had been incidents, they said, groups from the cities arriving by truck, crowding the edges of villages, pressing into barns. Constables were too few and sometimes cowed. Could American troops be seen along the roads at night? Could a jeep make a slow circuit of the paddies after dark? A squad sent to such a task would deploy as they had been trained: spread out, maintain fields of fire, keep in sight of one another. They moved along the narrow ridges between flooded plots, boots finding balance on slick earth. Their rifles were loaded, but safety catches were on. They understood the rules of engagement. Firearms were a last resort. A shouted warning, a show of force, a flare into the sky, these were to be tried before any bullet left a barrel. For men drilled in assault tactics, this was a new kind of frontline, a boundary not between nations but between those who had harvested food and those desperate enough to take it. Higher up the chain of command, the logic behind such deployments was strategic as well as humanitarian. MacArthur and his staff, from their headquarters in Tokyo's Daiichi building, read daily summaries of conditions across the country. Reports from Japanese ministries and SCAP's own officers painted a stark picture. The 1945-46 winter would be harsh. Urban rations were dropping. Rural tensions were rising. The potential for food riots, strikes, and politically charged unrest loomed. American policy toward Japan was already shifting in response to global currents. The Soviet Union's moves in Northeast Asia and Europe convinced Washington that a chaotic, starving Japan could become a liability. Stabilizing the country, preventing radicalization, and integrating it into a non-communist post-war order became urgent priorities. Food policy lay at the center of that effort. SCAP pressed the Japanese government to increase rice collections from farmers, but also insisted that requisition be carried out with some degree of fairness to avoid open revolt in the countryside. At the same time, American grain ships were diverted to Japanese ports despite domestic shortages in the United States. Every sack of wheat landed in Yokohama or Kobe represented a political calculation. Relief now might mean loyalty later. Below the level of grand strategy, practical questions demanded answers. Who would protect stored food from theft? How would trains carrying grain through impoverished districts be defended? Could Japanese police, tainted by their wartime role and weakened by hunger, be trusted to manage alone? The answer, increasingly, was that occupation troops would supplement them. Marine and Army units received instructions to cooperate with Japanese authorities in safeguarding essential resources. Sometimes this meant ring-fencing a government granary with armed guards. Sometimes it meant stationing a squad at a rural rail halt where rumors suggested that returning soldiers planned to intercept shipments. Sometimes, when prefectural officials insisted that tensions in certain villages were high, it meant something humbler: a few foreign soldiers seen at dusk near the fields, their very presence a deterrent. From the perspective of a divisional headquarters, assigning a platoon to such tasks was a matter of allocating manpower. From the perspective of a village headman, it was a gamble, inviting former enemies into the heart of his community in the hope that their guns would protect, not threaten. That gamble was shaped by years of words and images. For more than a decade, the Japanese state had painted the Americans in lurid colors. Schoolchildren learned of enemy cruelty. Films showed caricatured Westerners as crude, animalistic, driven by greed and lust. Posters warned women and girls to expect violation if captured. The last months of war intensified this message. On Okinawa and in Saipan, military propaganda drove some civilians to suicide rather than face surrender. Those stories seeped into every village, including the one where the old farmer bent over his paddies. He had no reason to doubt them. The Americans controlled the seas, the skis, they had dropped bombs that turned cities into ash. It was not hard to imagine them turning that destruction onto humble homes and fields. The surrender disrupted not only armies but narratives. SCAP's civil censorship detachment moved quickly to silence outright militarist propaganda. Newspapers and radio were barred from criticizing the occupation or discussing its more controversial aspects too frankly. But they were also freed, under guidance, to publish images of American soldiers behaving in ways that contradicted wartime caricatures, handing out candy to children, helping clear rubble, standing respectfully outside shrines. In the streets and lanes, lived experience became its own form of information. Japanese civilians watched how soldiers behaved when drunk, how they reacted to an accidental bump or a frightened stare. Whether they paid fairly in the new military script or tried to take without asking. Women judged the safety of walking alone at dusk by what they and their neighbors saw, not by any directive from Tokyo. There were abuses, of course, incidents of theft, of assault, of arrogance. No occupation of such scale proceeds without stain. But the overall pattern, especially compared to the apocalyptic visions of wartime propaganda, was one of discipline and relative restraint. For many Japanese, the first surprise was that the conquerors did not simply seize everything within reach. The second surprise came in smaller moments, like the one that unfolded by the rice field. When word reached the old farmer that American soldiers would be posted near his paddies that night, the reflexive fear formed by years of warnings returned. Foreign boots in the mud, foreign rifles by the water's edge, this was what he had been told to dread. Yet the threat pressing in from beyond the village's boundaries was no longer invasion but hunger in human form, strangers on the road, eyes fixed on the grain he had nursed to maturity. Between those two fears of the foreign soldier and of the desperate thief, he had to choose which one he could live with. The answer, as darkness fell and figures in unfamiliar uniforms took their posts along the dikes, would begin to show itself in the tension of that single night. By the time the rice turned yellow in the paddies, the war felt both very near and very far. In the hills above the harbor at Sasebo, American flags snapped in the wind over former Imperial Navy buildings. Down in the valley where the old farmer lived, the symbols of defeat were quieter. School books with pages torn out, a shrine gate with its patriotic placards removed, a radio that now carried strange, clipped English phrases from a new authority in Tokyo. The harvest was approaching, and with it fear. Stories moved along the narrow roads faster than carts. In the market town, a younger farmer had seen them, groups of thin, determined men and women from the city stepping down from packed trains, fanning out along the lanes with sacks and bundles. Some offered high prices, waving crumpled yen bills or trinkets from bombed-out homes. Others did not bother with bargaining. They filled their bags and left complaints behind. In one neighboring village, someone said a barn had been stormed by a crowd from Nagasaki. The owner protested. He was shoved aside. The local police, 2 men with pistols and threadbare uniforms, could do little against 50 pairs of hands and the hunger behind them. The old farmer listened at the edge of these conversations, arms folded into his sleeves. His own barn was modest. His share of the harvest after meeting government demands would barely see his household through winter. He had already lost too much, 2 sons in distant campaigns, a 3rd son missing since Okinawa, a daughter's child failing to thrive on watered-down gruel. Each stalk in his field now held the weight of all that loss. The village headman convened a meeting in the schoolhouse. Tatami mats were rolled aside to make space. Men and women sat in neat rows while kerosene lamps hissed. A district policeman, cap in hand, cleared his throat and spoke of disturbances in nearby hamlets. He advised vigilance, cooperation, calm. His hand, resting on the hilt of his sidearm, trembled slightly. Then he mentioned something new. The Americans had offered assistance. A murmur ran through the room. Assistance could mean many things. Everyone knew the foreign troops were in the region. Their trucks sometimes passed on the main road, filled with men whose faces were hard to read. Children peered from behind fences when they went by. Women looked away. The policeman explained, choosing his words with care. The American commander in the area had been informed of the tensions around the harvest. If requested, he said, a squad of Marines could be posted near the most vulnerable fields on certain nights. They would not enter houses. They would not interfere with local customs. They would simply stand watch, their presence discouraging anyone who thought to come in numbers and take what was not theirs. Silence settled over the villagers. The idea of inviting foreign soldiers into the heart of their work cut across years of teaching. Old men glanced at one another, at the scrolls hanging in the corner that once urged loyalty unto death. Young mothers thought of the warnings they had whispered to their daughters. Accepting such help felt to some like another surrender. But the winter ahead was long, and the rice in the paddies did not care who wore a uniform. In the end, practicality outweighed pride. The headman bowed formally to the policeman and agreed to make the request. A note went to the district office. The district office sent a message through an interpreter to the nearest Marine command post. The words changed language and hands several times, but the meaning remained: one village, one stretch of fields, one night of potential trouble. In a requisition building on the outskirts of Sasebo, a Marine lieutenant unfolded the paper and read the request. He had no need to imagine hunger. He had seen the lines outside ration stations in the city, the thin faces watching his men with a mixture of fear and hope. He also understood that a few visible successes, a quiet night here, a shipment arriving unmolested there, would be noted by his own superiors. He called a sergeant, outlined the situation, and gave the order. A squad would go out at dusk, linked up with the Japanese policeman and village headman, and take positions along the dikes. They were to be alert but restrained. Warning shots, flares, loud commands through the interpreter if needed. No heroics, no brutality. Their task was deterrence. That afternoon, as the sun slid behind broken clouds, the Marines checked their gear in a courtyard that still bore the faint outlines of Imperial Navy insignia on its walls. Rifles were cleaned, ammunition counted, bayonets left sheathed. A box of signal flares was added to their load. One of the men, who had seen civilians driven in front of tanks on Saipan, shook his head at the strangeness of it all. From assaulting pillboxes to babysitting a rice crop in less than a year. They climbed into the back of a truck, the canvas flaps tied up to let in the cool air, and rumbled out of the city. The road narrowed as it left the last concrete buildings behind. Telephone poles marched along the verge. Beyond them, terraced fields stepped up into the hills, each level a mosaic of yellowing grain. In the distance, a temple bell sounded faintly. The truck stopped where the dirt road met the edge of the village. The headman was waiting, cap in hand, flanked by the district policeman. Their bows were deep, their faces composed but tight. An interpreter, a young Nisei in American uniform, translated brief formalities. There were no handshakes. Such gestures would come later in other years. Together they walked toward the paddies. The fields lay in a shallow bowl between low ridges, the water in them reflecting the darkening sky. Narrow earthen paths crisscrossed the plots, just wide enough for one man to walk. Here and there, scarecrows leaned at odd angles, their straw bodies bowed like tired shoulders. The headman gestured toward the far edge, where a footpath connected the paddies to the road leading to the station. He spoke softly. That was where outsiders had been seen before, lingering at dusk, measuring with their eyes. It was there, he suggested, that a watchful presence would be most needed. The sergeant nodded. He pointed in turn to positions along the dikes, spacing his men so that each could see the next in line. The Marines slung their rifles, adjusted their packs, and stepped down into the mud, boots finding uncertain purchase on the narrow ridges the farmer had shaped over years of patient labor. From the edge of his plot, the old man watched them come. To his eye, they were both exactly as imagined and entirely different. The helmets, the weapons, the foreignness of their clothes matched the drawings he had once seen in crude wartime pamphlets, but their movements were measured, not wild. Their gazes swept the horizon, not the houses. They treated the dikes with a cautious respect born of simple self-preservation. A misstep would mean a fall into cold water, an undignified end for any illusion of invincibility. He stood just back from the field, hands clasped, as the light faded and the men spread out along the boundaries of his year's work. Above them, the sky shifted from gray to indigo. The sounds of the village, the clink of pots, a baby's cry, the murmur of evening prayers faded into the background. In their place came the gentle slap of water against earth, the soft creak of leather, the occasional low cough of a soldier settling into his post. The line between his fear and their duty had been drawn. Now the night would test what it meant. Night gathered in layers. First came the dimming of color, the gold of the rice turning to a muted gray. Then the air cooled, a damp chill settling into cloth and skin. Crickets' chirps thickened into a background hum. In the village, lamps winked out one by one until only a few pinpricks of light marked houses where someone still sat awake listening. Along the dikes, the Marines adjusted to the dark. They spread themselves in a loose arc that traced the edge of the fields, each man close enough to glimpse the next as a darker shape against the night. Some stood, shifting weight from foot to foot to keep circulation in their toes. Others crouched or sat on their packs, rifles laid across their knees, ears tuned to sounds beyond the paddies. A dog barking, distant voices on the road, the faint clatter of a train much too far away to matter. Their training asserted itself in small gestures. A man checked his watch, nodding the time by touch and habit. Another cupped a hand around the glow of a cigarette to hide it from view, the ember briefly illuminating a tired face before being pinched out. The sergeant moved slowly along the line, a shadow among shadows, pausing now and then to murmur a reminder or to listen. Near the center of the arc, a Nisei interpreter sat slightly back from the dike, where the narrow path widened into firmer ground. He knew his role would matter if bodies appeared out of the dark, not to shout threats, but to give words to the presence of these silent figures from across the sea. The field itself seemed to breathe. The rice plants, heavy with grain, rustled faintly as a breeze moved over them like an old man exhaling in his sleep. The water in the paddies reflected nothing now but the absence of light. From the edge of his plot, the farmer watched until his eyes ached. At first his gaze lingered on the rifles. He traced their outlines the way his fingers once traced the ridges of a plow, familiar in concept, foreign in detail. He thought of the bullets they had carried across Pacific Islands, the lives they had taken. Now those same barrels pointed outward, away from his home, toward the invisible line where road became threat. He stepped closer to the dike, stopping just before the mud. His sandals sank slightly into the softer earth. A Marine, noticing the movement, turned his head. For a heartbeat the two men regarded one another, one in patched cotton, one in government-issued wool and canvas. Neither spoke. Then the Marine inclined his head just enough to acknowledge the presence without inviting more. The farmer responded with a shallow bow, as much instinct as intention. Time lengthened. An hour passed, then another. The sounds of the village dwindled to near silence. Somewhere upriver a dog barked twice and fell quiet. Once, toward midnight, a muffled rhythm of footsteps could be heard on the road beyond the fields, a small group perhaps moving along the lane from the station. The Marines tensed, shoulders straightening, rifles sliding slightly more to the ready. Shadows appeared at the far margin of sight, indistinct shapes against the deeper dark of the road. They halted for a long moment as if conferring. From his place near the center, the interpreter raised his voice in careful Japanese, calling out a neutral warning. The fields were guarded, the village was under protection tonight. There was a murmur in reply, too soft to parse. Then the shadows shifted, not toward the paddies but along the road, their outlines thinning as they moved away. The sound of feet on packed earth faded. Whether they had come with intent or merely passed by, none of the Marines could say for sure. What remained was the awareness that their silhouettes, rifles and all, had been seen and weighed. The old farmer had heard the footsteps as well. His pulse, already quick from the strain of watching, climbed higher. He could not distinguish the words called into the night, but he understood the tone, not the bark of a conqueror but the controlled voice of someone laying a boundary. He thought of barns in neighboring villages, of men pushed aside in their own doorways. He thought of his grandson's thin wrists, of his daughter's tired eyes. For the first time, the sight of foreign weapons between his field and the road brought not just fear but a flicker of relief. Around the third hour, the cold sank deeper. Marines stamped their feet gently to keep feeling in their toes. One pulled his collar tighter against his neck, drawing in the smell of wool, oil, and mud. The sergeant moved less now, conserving his own energy. Above them, a ragged patch of cloud tore open to reveal a scattering of stars, sharp and distant. The farmer slipped away into the dark and returned some time later with a small tray. On it, balanced with both hands, sat a dented kettle and a handful of rough, mismatched cups. The tea inside was thin, a pale ghost of the aromatic brews of peacetime, but it was hot. He approached the nearest Marine slowly, making sure his outline was visible, stopping well short of arm's length. Then he bent at the waist, presenting the tray like an offering at a shrine. The soldier, surprised, hesitated. The interpreter, catching sight of the exchange, walked over and murmured a translation. The farmer wished to share tea. It was a gesture of thanks. The Marine glanced toward his sergeant, received a brief nod, and reached out carefully. His gloved hands closed around one of the cups, fingers brushing the chipped porcelain. He brought it to his lips, the steam briefly fogging the lower edge of his helmet. The tea was almost flavorless, but its warmth spread through his chest. One by one, along the line, the cups made their way into tired hands. Each time the farmer bowed, each time a soldier returned the gesture in his own awkward way, a dip of the head, a hand briefly pressed to the chest. No speeches were made, no promises were given. The shared warmth in the cold night said enough. It was then, seeing the men who had once been described to him as beasts handling his poor cups with an almost exaggerated care, that something in the old farmer finally broke. The years of slogans, of anxious nights by the radio, of imagining nameless enemies descending upon his land, collided with the simple reality before him, young foreigners far from their own homes, standing guard so that his family might eat. The weight of sons not returned, of harvests given up to war, pressed down all at once. His eyes filled in the dark. He tried to blink the wetness away, but it blurred the outlines of the men and the rice and the sky into one shapeless mass. A sound escaped him, half sob, half suppressed cough. He turned his head aside, ashamed of the loss of control, but the tears kept coming, tracing lines through the dust on his cheeks. One of the Marines, noticing the old man's shoulders shaking, looked to the interpreter in wordless question. The younger man listened for a moment, then spoke softly in English. The farmer was relieved, he said. He had been very afraid. He had not expected to see Americans guarding rather than taking. No one replied. There was nothing adequate to say. The night moved on. Eventually the farmer withdrew into the shadows, leaving the soldiers to their watch. He lay down on his mat later than usual, the sounds of boots on the dike and water lapping at earth still echoing in his ears. Just before dawn, the eastern sky paled to a muted silver. The silhouettes along the dikes became figures again. Birds began to stir in the reeds. The Marines, stiff and chilled, shifted from their posts as the sergeant moved down the line with quiet words. They would be relieved soon, returning to the city and to whatever orders awaited them next. As they regrouped near the edge of the village, the headman appeared once more, flanked by a few elders. They bowed deeply. The interpreters passed along simple phrases of gratitude. The Marines answered with nods, brief smiles, the clumsy salutations of men unused to such ceremonies. The old farmer stood a little apart, hands folded. When the truck's engine rumbled to life and the foreign soldiers began to climb aboard, he stepped forward as far as he dared and bent from the waist until his back protested, holding the bow until the vehicle had turned and the line of helmets had vanished behind the curve of the road. Behind him, his rice field lay intact, each stalk heavy with grain. Nights like this, replicated in different forms across the occupied country, did not erase the devastation of the war or the inequalities of defeat. But they left impressions in villagers' memories, in Marines' letters home, that would shape how both sides understood whatever came next. The harvest would be gathered. Then the question would become what kind of future could be built on fields that former enemies had, for one cold night, defended together. The rice went in under a sky the color of old tin. In the weeks after the Marines' truck vanished around the bend, life in the village settled back into its narrow grooves. Men and women cut the ripened stalks with practiced motions, bundling and stacking them to dry. Children trailed along the dikes, gathering stray grains in their hands. The old farmer moved more slowly than he once had, but his fingers still knew the feel of a full head of rice, the satisfying weight of a sack tied tight. The difference this year was that more of those sacks stayed where they belonged. There were still obligations. Government agents arrived with their ledgers, calculating quotas, reminding farmers that the state, now under foreign supervision, still had first claim. But the fear that had hung over the harvest, the dread of a sudden surge of empty faces on the road and hands in the barn, had ebbed. Word had spread that in some districts where raiding parties tried to force the issue, Japanese police and American troops together had blocked the way. The grain that did leave the valley traveled under watchful eyes. At the small station down the road, men heaved sacks into freight cars while a couple of Marines, uniforms slightly rumpled from long hours, stood nearby with rifles slung. A district policeman checked documents, sweating despite the chill. When the train finally pulled away toward the city, the old farmer, watching from a distance, saw not just cargo departing, but a portion of his winter walking out of sight. In Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, and Hiroshima, that winter of 1945-46 came to be remembered as one of bone-deep fatigue. The Japanese coined a word for it, kyodatsu, exhaustion. It described more than hunger, a sense of spiritual collapse after years of mobilization and loss. Streets were filled with people who moved as if underwater, shoulders stooped, eyes dulled by too much grief and too little food. Ration lines lengthened. Official distributions, already meager, fell further behind promised levels. In some neighborhoods, the daily calories allotted dropped well below what an adult needed simply to maintain weight. Those with something left to sell, kimono, watches, family scrolls, crowded the black markets, trading pieces of their past for whatever could be chewed and swallowed. Against this backdrop, the rice that arrived from valleys like the Old Farmer was both salvation and spark. In some cities, workers, veterans, and housewives organized Food May Day demonstrations, protesting shortages and distribution failures. In early 1946, thousands marched in Tokyo, Osaka, and other centers, demanding rice, not democracy. They did not chant against the American flag directly. Censorship and calculation prevented that, but the underlying anger at a system that left children hungry while grain moved under guard was palpable. SCAP's daily briefings recorded these tensions in clipped phrases: food situation critical, risk of unrest, need for emergency imports. MacArthur pushed Washington for more shipments, arguing that starvation in Japan would be a political disaster. Slowly, American wheat and other grains began to arrive in quantities large enough to matter, though never enough to make hunger vanish. In the countryside where the farmer lived, the sensation was different but no less intense. His family had more to eat than their relatives in the city. There were thin slices of pickled radish, small fish from the river, greens gathered from the margins of fields. On good days, a bowl of rice almost like those before the war, though the grains might be mixed with barley or millet to stretch them. But he could not ignore the letters that still came from his married daughter in Nagasaki, asking if just a little more could be spared, if a small parcel might be sent by train. Each time he filled a cloth bag with grain and wrapped it in paper, he thought of the night the Americans had stood between his field and the world outside. Their presence had bought him a margin, nothing more but nothing less. That margin allowed him to share a portion of his harvest without endangering his own household beyond endurance. The memory of their boots in his mud did not become a story of friendship overnight. Suspicion and pride ran deep. Some villagers still muttered that it was shameful to rely on former enemies, that Japan's fate should be borne alone. Others, watching their children grow a little less gaunt, were willing to accept any help that did not come with rough hands. Children less bound by old narratives adapted first. When Marines passed through the nearby town on patrol, small figures began to shadow them at a cautious distance. A tossed chocolate bar, a stick of chewing gum, an awkwardly patted head, these tiny exchanges circulated back to the village in breathless retellings. The Americans, it seemed, were strange but not the monsters of bedtime warnings. For the Marines themselves, the memory of the rice field joined a growing catalog of occupation impressions. Letters home mentioned skinny kids, polite people, a country that's beat to hell but still planting. Some men, returning to the United States when their tour ended, would find it hard to explain to relatives who still saw Japan only as the enemy why the thought of a muddy dike under a cold sky lingered. The immediate crisis did not resolve quickly. Deaths from malnutrition and related diseases continued through 1946, especially in urban slums and among the very old and very young. Yet the combination of preserved domestic harvests, however reduced, and increasing foreign imports prevented the outright famine that some had feared. In that precarious balance, nights like the one in the old farmer's village played a small but real part. Each unrated field, each shipment that reached a city intact, nudged the country a little further from the edge. Underneath these fragile day-to-day struggles over grain and hunger, another, deeper change was beginning, one that would transform not just how rice was protected, but who owned the soil in which it grew. In the years before the war, the old farmer had bowed twice each season. Once to the land itself, hands pressed on his knees as he thanked the earth for giving back what he asked of it. And once to the landlord, a man in a distant town or a family that rarely set foot in the village, who owned the titles to the fields he worked. Like millions of others, he was a tenant. He paid in rice, a share of his harvest carted off each year in addition to the state's requisitions. Some landlords were fairer than others, some reinvested in tools or flood control, some did not. Either way, the relationship was clear. The man who bent his back in the water did not truly own the mud between his toes. After defeat, that hierarchy too came under scrutiny. SCAP's staff, advised by economists and agrarian specialists, looked at Japan's rural structure and saw a problem: large landlords with political influence, tenants with little stake in the system, memories of peasant unrest from earlier decades. In a Cold War climate, such an arrangement seemed like fertile ground for radical movements. Land reform became a priority. Between 1946 and the early 1950s, under American pressure and Japanese legislation, a sweeping program was implemented. The government bought out many landlord holdings at fixed prices, Tenants were given the chance to purchase the plots they had worked for generations, paying over time in installments, subject to ceilings on how much any one household could own. The process was not smooth or entirely just. Some landlords found ways to keep desirable parcels through relatives. Some tenants struggled with payments. Local officials, themselves products of pre-war networks, adjusted the letter of the law to suit local circumstances, but the overall effect was unmistakable. By the end of the reform, the share of farmland tilled by owners had risen dramatically. The number of large estate owners shrank. In village after village, elderly men took in their hands, for the first time, papers that said the rows of paddies they weeded were legally theirs. If the old farmer lived long enough, and many of his generation did, he would likely have been among them. He would have walked with the headman to the prefectural office, hat in hand, to sign the necessary forms. He would have listened with half an ear as a clerk explained boundaries and payments. What mattered to him was simpler: the knowledge that no distant landlord could suddenly change terms or reclaim what his family had shaped with their labor. In that sense, the night the Marines watched over his rice and the day he received his own deed were part of the same, larger arc. Power over the land and over the food it produced was edging downward from state and landlord toward the hands that actually turned the soil. This new security had consequences beyond the paddies. Many rural households, newly anchored in property, valued stability above all. They remembered the thin winters, the near miss with mass hunger, and drew their own conclusions. Political parties that promised order, gradual improvement, and protection of small landholders found receptive ears. Radical calls for collectivization or revolutionary redistribution sounded less attractive to men who now had something tangible to lose. At the national level, as the 1940s gave way to the 1950s, the strategic relationship between Japan and the United States hardened into alliance. The outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 turned Japan into a vital logistical base. American money and contracts flowed in. Factories that had been silent began to hum again. The memory of American bombers did not fade, but it was layered over by the sight of American dollars rebuilding workshops and docks. In rural Kyushu, change came more slowly. Electricity lines crept into valleys, dirt paths were widened and paved. Children who had once trailed behind their grandparents in the mud walked instead to new schools, carrying textbooks that spoke less of empire and more of constitutions and rights. Radio announcements that had once blared martial songs now carried weather reports and baseball scores. Yet under these new rhythms, the old stories persisted. In interviews collected decades later, elderly villagers in western Japan sometimes reached back past the land reform and the high-growth years to a more fragile moment. They spoke of the first Americans they had seen not at a distance in the sky, but close enough to smell the leather of their boots. They remembered fear that tasted like metal on the tongue, and they remembered the first cracks in that fear. One man recalled in a calm voice that the soldiers stood by the fields and nobody came to take the rice. Another described how her father, who had lost 2 brothers to the war, cried when he saw them helping the police. He said, "They are not like what we were told." For the Marines who had stood those quiet watches, memory took a different shape. Some returned home, used the GI Bill to study, started families, moved inland to towns where rice paddies were as foreign as the moon. Now and then, perhaps at a reunion or in a moment of private reflection, an autumn night in Japan surfaced. A field lit only by stars, an old man bowing low, the awareness that for once their rifles were not instruments of destruction but of reassurance. Few of those men would have recognized the Japan that emerged a generation later. Factories exporting radios and cars to their own hometowns, tourists from Tokyo snapping photographs on American sidewalks. Fewer still would have traced that transformation back to a muddy dike or a dented teacup under a chill sky. History usually remembers bigger decisions. The surrender broadcast, the treaties signed, the economic plans drafted in government offices. Yet the fabric that held post-war Japan together was woven in part from thousands of small, nearly anonymous moments of restraint and cooperation, moments when former enemies chose not to take but to protect. In one village, in one autumn, that choice meant an old man's field remained whole, and his family's winter was less harsh than it might have been. From such fragile increments, a devastated country took its first steps away from collapse and toward a future neither side had imagined in 1945. In the long catalog of the Pacific War, there are names that dominate the maps: Midway, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. They are measured in tonnage of bombs dropped, divisions committed, bodies counted. They fit easily into textbooks and staff college lectures. A cold night by a rice field in Kyushu does not. No communiques were issued about it. No medals were pinned for standing in mud while crickets sang and old fears slowly cracked. The men involved were figures at the margins: an aging tenant farmer, a handful of Marines on occupation duty, a local policeman trying to hold a slender line. Yet in what they did and what they did not do lay a quiet reversal as consequential as any formal surrender. Modern war often reduces the enemy to abstractions: tonnage destroyed, divisions annihilated, food potential denied. In the planning for an invasion of Japan that never came, Allied staff had calculated the value of rice fields as obstacles to be flooded, as resources to be captured or ruined. The end of the war offered another path. The same power that could have starved a defeated country chose instead, however imperfectly, to keep it fed. That choice was expressed not only in policy papers and shipping manifests, but in the posture of young men on a dike, muzzles angled away from the people whose lives depended on the grain at their backs. For the old farmer, the moment when tears came unbidden was less about gratitude to foreign soldiers than about a sudden disorienting recognition. The world he had been taught to expect was not the one unfolding in front of him. The enemy had faces, and those faces could hold watch, not just wrath. For the Marines, the realization moved in the other direction. The country they had fought across oceans to defeat contained not just uniformed foes, but fragile, ordinary lives much like their own. In the decades that followed, Japan and the United States would bind themselves together with treaties, trade, and a shared strategic calculus. Beneath those structures lay memories like that night, unrecorded moments when restraint replaced revenge, when the victor's power was used to guard, not to take. Somewhere in Kyushu, the dikes of that valley have been reshaped, the wooden houses rebuilt or replaced. The old farmer is gone. The Marines have long since grown old and passed. But the field they protected for one thin slice of time stands as a reminder that even amid the wreckage of total war, the course of history can hinge on something as simple and as profound as choosing to guard another man's harvest until dawn.